Robert-François Damiens tried to assassinate the King of France with a small penknife that barely broke the skin. For this failed attempt, he endured 4 hours of the most elaborate public torture in French history, watched by over 100,000 screaming spectators. But Damiens' agony wasn't really about punishing him. It was about terrorizing an entire nation into submission through what psychologists now call vicarious trauma conditioning. What happened to Damiens on the breaking wheel reveals how public spectacles of extreme punishment can psychologically control millions of people who never experience the torture themselves. And this same psychological weapon is being used against you every single day. Versailles, January 5, 1757. Robert-François Damiens was a 42-year-old domestic servant who had spent his life invisible to the nobility he served. Historical records describe him as quiet, unremarkable, and deeply religious, exactly the kind of person the aristocracy never noticed. But Damiens had been watching, listening, and seething at the injustices he witnessed daily. Damiens wasn't a trained assassin or political revolutionary. He was a man driven to desperation by watching the suffering of common people, while the nobility lived in obscene luxury. When he approached King Louis XV with a small penknife, he wasn't trying to kill the king. He was trying to wound him just enough to make him think about his people. Damiens' assassination attempt was pathetic by any measure. His knife barely penetrated the king's winter clothing, inflicting a wound so minor that Louis XV was back to his royal duties within days. In any rational justice system, Damiens would have faced imprisonment or quick execution. But Louis XV and his advisors saw an opportunity for something far more valuable than justice. They saw a chance to demonstrate absolute power through absolute terror. Modern psychology has identified why the French authorities chose such extreme public punishment for Damiens' minor attack. Dr. Stanley Milgram's research on authority and Dr. Philip Zimbardo's work on social control show that witnessing extreme punishment creates behavioral modification through vicarious trauma. People who watch suffering become psychologically conditioned to avoid any behavior that might result in similar consequences. Terror spectacles work by exploiting the human brain's inability to distinguish between direct and observed threats. When 100,000 people watched Damiens being tortured, their amygdalas activated as if they were experiencing the torture themselves. This creates lasting psychological conditioning that affects behavior for years after witnessing the event. But spectacle terror goes beyond just scaring witnesses. The breaking wheel was designed to create what psychologists call transmission trauma, biological damage that spreads through communities like a virus. People who witnessed Damiens' torture would describe it to others, spreading the fear exponentially. One man's suffering became an entire nation's psychological conditioning. Louis XV understood that Damiens' punishment wasn't really about Damiens, it was about demonstrating that royal authority was absolute and that resistance, no matter how minor, would result in consequences so severe that they defied comprehension. The breaking wheel became a tool for programming entire populations to self-censor and submit. March 28, 1757. The Place de Grève in Paris had been transformed into an amphitheater of horror. Damiens was brought before the breaking wheel while 100,000 spectators watched from specially constructed viewing platforms. The authorities had sold tickets to this execution like it was entertainment, because in their minds it was. Damiens' torture followed a carefully choreographed sequence designed for maximum psychological impact on the crowd. First came the ceremonial reading of his crimes, amplified so every spectator could hear. Then the removal of his clothing, reducing him from person to object. Finally, the methodical breaking of his limbs on the wheel while he remained conscious and screaming. Witnesses report people cheering at each breaking bone, vendors selling food and drink, and families bringing children to learn about the consequences of defying authority. The spectacle had transformed civilized people into a mob that enjoyed watching systematic destruction. The most disturbing aspect of Damiens' execution wasn't his physical suffering. It was how the crowd's reaction validated the authorities' psychological strategy. By the end of 4 hours, 100,000 people had been conditioned to associate any form of resistance with unthinkable consequences. Louis XV had successfully programmed an entire population through one man's agony. Every principle that terrorized 18th century France through Damiens' execution operates in modern media and social control, but amplified through technology to reach billions of spectators simultaneously. From viral public shamings to police brutality videos to political persecution spectacles, the breaking wheel has gone digital. Modern media deliberately amplifies extreme punishment stories to create the same vicarious trauma conditioning that worked on Damiens' crowd. When videos of police violence, public shamings, or extreme legal consequences go viral, they serve the same psychological function as the breaking wheel conditioning entire populations to fear resistance through observed suffering. Workplace environments use Damiens' sectacle terror through public firings, humiliation in meetings, and company-wide examples of what happens to troublemakers. One employee's public destruction serves to psychologically condition all other employees to avoid questioning authority or advocating for change. Authoritarian systems master spectacle terror by making examples of high-profile dissidents, ensuring maximum media coverage of arrests, trials, and punishments. The goal isn't just to punish the individual, it's to create vicarious trauma in millions of observers who will self-censor to avoid similar consequences. Cancel culture operates on Damiens' exact psychological principle: extreme public consequences for relatively minor transgressions, amplified through social media to create maximum spectacle impact. The punishment is designed to be disproportionate because the goal isn't justice, it's conditioning millions of observers to self-censor. Robert-François Damiens died believing his sacrifice would inspire others to resist injustice. Instead, his spectacular torture created exactly the opposite effect. It taught an entire nation that resistance was futile and that authority was absolute. But understanding how spectacle terror works gives you the power to resist its psychological conditioning. Robert Greene warns about the dangers of challenging power directly, but Damiens' story reveals something more important. Authorities often create extreme spectacles, specifically to discourage resistance. When you see disproportionate consequences for minor challenges to authority, you're witnessing the modern breaking wheel in action. In the comments, share a time when you recognized that an extreme public punishment was designed more to scare observers than to deliver justice. What helped you see through the spectacle to the psychological manipulation underneath? Hit subscribe because we're exposing how history's most brutal spectacles are being replicated in modern systems of control. Every story reveals another way authority uses extreme examples to program mass behavior, and every understanding gives you more power to resist the conditioning. Damiens' torture was designed to make you afraid to resist. Don't let his suffering program your submission. Recognize spectacle terror for what it is: psychological manipulation disguised as justice. The breaking wheel taught 100,000 people to fear resistance. Make sure you're not one of them.